Well, it's an honor and really just a pleasure to be moderating this event, which is about Czech literature and Czech literature in English, which is what the environment I spend a lot of time in. We're not here mostly to listen to these people who are really involved in the profession of bringing Czech literature to an English-speaking audience. So I'd like to briefly introduce each of them, and first of all to just introduce in absentia the one great translator who was on the program but could not make it, and that's my mentor, Professor Peter Kusi, my predecessor as lecturer in Czech at Columbia University, and of course, great translator of Kundera, Grusha, and many other wonderful Czech authors, a guy who's done just tremendous service to Czech literature and to the Czech language. Peter was just not feeling well enough today to make it to this event, which is a shame. However, we do have three of the other, I would say, most important people in North America for Czech literature, and so to introduce them briefly, give you my personal introduction. There's information on each of these people in the program, which I won't repeat, just to, as I say, what these people mean to me. Paul Wilson, who gave a keynote address at our workshop on Friday, and who's a tremendous inspiration to me, both for the work he's done translating some of my favorite books, like I Serve the King of England by Bohemian and others, but also giving this tremendous example that North American and English-speaking North American could actually go into that strange environment and live in it and become part of it and become a legend within it. So I've gone and lived there. I haven't yet achieved the legendary status Paul has, but I've got, yeah, I figure I've got four more years to work on that. Rob Wechsler, to whom I'm extremely grateful for the work he's done with Catholic Press, which has made available a huge percentage of the books that are on my syllabi. If they weren't there, I don't know exactly what I would teach. Again, a tremendous service that Rob's work has done to bring both contemporary and slightly older Czech literature to an English-speaking audience. And Rob's also done great work as a translator himself, and sort of a wonderful book on the art of translation that I highly recommend to you. So please welcome back. And finally, Alex Zucker, my fellow disciple of Peter Kusi, and a man who has translated recent books from Czech, which were considered basically untranslatable. I'm just in awe of what Alex has done with some of the best and most demanding contemporary Czech authors, translating notably Joachim Koppel's Sestra, a book which has left such a mark on me that my firstborn son's name is Joachim. So, Alex Zucker. So, the format of our program this evening is I get to hog the proceedings a little bit first and pose a few questions to our participants, and then after a while I will turn over the floor to you, because I'm sure that many of you have specific or general questions you would like to pose to our distinguished guests. So the first question I have that I would like each of our participants to respond to is about your beginnings as a translator from Czech into English. And so the first part of that question would be, at what point did you feel sufficiently confident in your literacy in Czech and in English to attempt to translate a work of Czech literature into English? So that would be the first part of the question. And the second part of the question was, what was the first work of Czech literature you translated, and what led you to that project? Paul?
Okay, this is it's a difficult question, because when I first I went to Czechoslovakia with no ambition whatsoever to become a translator. I don't think anyone actually has ambition to become a translator. It's one of the things that happens to you. It's not something you choose. But the very first night I was in Prague, and I'd barely been in the country for more than 12 hours, maybe 24 hours. I ran into a fellow who's still a friend of mine, of ours, who said he was very excited that I was coming to Prague to live for a year. This was 1967. And he pulled a book out of the shelf, and it was a book by a Czech philosopher that he was extremely fond of called Václav Klima, philosopher and novelist, very eccentric writer. And he said, you must translate this into English. and you know, I had no intention of even, I wasn't even thinking at that point of learning Czech. Translating it. But, you know, sorry? That's what everyone said. And so, you know, it was a rather odd request at that point. So the question was, at what point did I begin to think about you know, translating Czech literature into English? And I suppose it was at that point that the idea was planted in my mind. This was day one of my 10-year sojourn in Czechoslovakia. The first work that I started translating quite soon after that, because as I began teaching English, one of my teaching jobs was to teach every Friday at the University of the 17th of November, as it was called then. And I did not have African students, I had Czech students who were in a special translation department where they were learning how to translate at a kind of slightly higher level. So I immediately, or very soon after I began working with them, we began doing translations into English from Czech. And I surreptitiously used this as a way of learning Czech because I would give them short texts by Joseph Škvorecký, and I would have them. There was a kind of a cabaret style sort of literary evenings in Prague called Textopy. And there was, you know, Ivan Vyskočil and Joseph Škvorecký were two of the writers who contributed to this. And so we took some of these texts and I had them translate them for me into English. And then I corrected their English, but at the same time I was learning Czech. So part of the process of learning Czech was the process of translating Škvorecký and Vyskočil and then other writers into English. The interesting thing is that there's this sort of style of publication called feuilleton in Czech, very short texts. There were some Czech writers like Jan Skacel from Brno who were extremely adept at writing one-page text, which were perfect for an hour because you could translate the whole text, the whole work in one lesson. So that was, I suppose, the first Czech literature that I, in collaboration with my students, translated were these short texts by Czech writers. But the first like real job that I had was after I was expelled in 1977. And the first real work that I did was, which I would consider serious work, was Joseph Škvorecký's The Engineer of Human Souls. We can talk about that later, perhaps more, but I've said enough, and I'll pass that on.
Thank you, Paul. Rob?
Well, I have sort of an odd situation in a lot of these because I'm not primarily a translator. I've done very little translation and only one book. So my answer is basically I've never been fluent in Czech. And the interesting thing about that is that I would argue that fluency is, though very important, is in some ways not necessary. The more literary a text is, the more important it is that you can understand what the writer is doing and how the writer is doing it, and be able to create that in English than it is to know what each word, all the meanings of all the words. It really depends on how the writer, in terms of how much you need to know. A lot of great, particularly with poetry, a lot of great translations have been done by people who aren't fluent in the language, and it's a very inefficient way. I mean, nobody who's going to make a living or even do any serious amount of translation is, if they're not fluent, it's going to take them forever. So it's very important for that. But I did the one novel I translated actually because Paul was supposed to translate it, and he just didn't have enough time.
You didn't have enough money.
I thought I was a pretty good author. And I didn't have enough money to offset the time. Anyway, and so I loved the novel, and I decided to do it myself because it was so difficult that I figured that I could do it as well. And I also had the advantage, one, of working, having Peter Cusey as also my mentor, to ask questions when I had problems. And the author's English was fairly good, and his daughter was a professional translator from English to Czech. So between them, I could ask lots of questions, and that really gave me the confidence to do it. But it was interesting because a lot of times I would read a sentence, these long sentences that had to be taken apart and put back together, and I couldn't make, it was really difficult to understand what he was doing. And there was actually a German translation of the novel, which I had, and my German was okay, so I could check it and see what they did. In almost every case where I found a sentence that was almost impossible, the sentence was not even translated in Czech, they just skipped it completely, which is one thing very different about American and European translation. Most European translations are written by people who make a living doing it. Most American translations are not written by people who make a living, so they tend to actually put more time into it because they're not doing it. They're not trying to see if they can get 6 novels translated in 1 year. And this person who translated it clearly was in a rush and just didn't bother. But I would ask Peter, and he couldn't make an attempt, and I would make an attempt. In most cases, actually, the author said I'd gotten it right, so I was very happy. But it was hard, and the harder it is, in a certain sense, the less it matters how fluent you are. So.
Well, would you say what you actually translated?
Oh, it's Alexander Kliment's. I translated it as Living Parallel. It's actually
Nudov Chekhov.
Yeah, Nudov Chekhov. Right, it's been so long. Yes, Nudov Chekhov, which doesn't work as a title in English very well. That's a lot of issue to talk about.
All right, so Peter Cusey, yeah. So Peter Cusey was, I always say he's my first Czech teacher, but actually he wasn't, because my interest in Czech actually began out of an interest in human rights in Eastern Europe. So I went to the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia to study East Central Europe and Czechoslovakia as part of that. And I went to Columbia because it was one of 2 schools in the country that had a program that had international affairs with somebody who taught Czech, who was Peter Cusey, although he was not in the international affairs school. And there were only 2 schools, well actually so, there was only one, Columbia was the only school in the country that allowed you to study Eastern Europe that had a separate institute that wasn't, everywhere else was Soviet and East European studies or Russian and East European studies. And Columbia had this institute on East Central Europe. So that, combined with the fact that there was somebody that who actually taught Czech, was the reason I applied to that school. And I think I got in because I had been to Czechoslovakia already, because I went there the first time in '87. And I started this grad school in '88. But now I got to take back what I just said, because the reason I went to Czechoslovakia the first time in '87 was because I had a girlfriend who gave me the Book of Laughter and Forgetting. So, but that was a book about politics as far as I was concerned. So that was my main interest in it. But I think the first day of Czech class, Cusey brought in a poem by Miroslav Volk. Yeah. And all I remember about it was that something about looking through a microscope and a reference to, I think his name is Don Carlos Williams. Is that right, the American poet? William Carlos Williams. Thank you. And so we were essentially translating